Awayithandi awayifuni
NUMSA yo NUMSA
ayiwafuna amaphutho
NUMSA
asiwafuna amakhapeta
NUMSA
lesohlale
yo NUMSA.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Workers' Power. Today, we've got a very interesting and very important guest on the show. His name is Professor Haidar Eid. He is the Associate Professor at Al-Aqsa University in Gaza. And for those of you who've been following what's happening in Gaza, you will know that this interview is one to watch. Professor Eid takes us through what is actually happening in Gaza right now. He speaks about it from his own personal experience. He's got two small children who were living in Gaza during the relentless bombing campaign by Apartheid Israel. So, of course, as a platform that gives voice to struggles all over the world, we are pleased to welcome Professor Eid. And of course, we are also promoting his book, Decolonising the Palestinian Mind. Good day and welcome to another episode of Workers' Power with Ms. Pax. And of course, I'm so excited to have you back. And today I have a special treat. With me today is a special guest from Gaza in Palestine. I'm sure many of our viewers are aware of what's taking place in Palestine and the role that Apartheid Israel is playing in basically trying to destroy and eliminate the entire population of Palestinian people. So we thought, because of the fact that we know that Palestinian people are suffering, and as a pro-working class platform, we felt it was important to use this episode to highlight this issue. And I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming to our studio Associate Professor Haidar Eid, who is an author, and he has actually written this wonderful book called Decolonising the Palestinian Mind. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Comrade Phakamile. I really appreciate it, and it's my honor to be addressing you and addressing, the South African people in general and the working class in particular.
Call me Pax. On this show,
Pax.
It's Pax. Thank
Sure.
you.
I will.
So let's just start right at the beginning. You are an associate professor of post-colonial and postmodern literature at Gaza's Al-Aqsa University. You've also authored this book, Worlding Postmodernism, Interpreters, Possibilities of Critical Theory, and Countering the Palestinian Nakba, One State for All. So you really have an in-depth understanding of what's going on in Gaza. And just to sort of kick off this interview, I'd like to read from your book, because you've actually been in Gaza. You are straight from Gaza.
That's correct.
You've been there since October 7th. And I just want to share an extract from this book with our viewers, where you basically say here, and I quote, "This book is being published while Gaza, where I live, is being annihilated. Amid the current genocidal attack carried out by Apartheid Israel against the 2.3 million residents of Gaza, my wife, our two daughters aged 6 and 7 and I were asked to leave our flat. We were trapped for about 24 hours in a very crowded, narrow room with at least 20 other people after being forced to flee our flat. We had no water, no food, no Wi-Fi, no data, no electricity. Israeli bombs are still raining down all around us."
Yeah.
What an intro. You are writing from a war zone.
That is correct. What happened is that on the third day of the genocide carried out by Apartheid Israel on Gaza, we were contacted by an Israeli intelligence officer, and we were asked to leave the area. I live in a neighborhood called Rimal neighborhood, a sort of upper middle class area in Gaza City itself, which is, you can call it the capital of the Gaza Strip, in general. And we were asked to leave and head to the north. at that time, they were killing people in the north and they were bombing, the north. So they asked us to move to an area that they were already bombing. And what happened is that we live in a residential tower. We live on the 10th floor, and we had to move very quickly because we thought that they were going to destroy the whole residential building because they are, in fact, in the habit of attacking residential towers. And we spent the night with our neighbors. And that night, they were bombing the whole neighborhood. I lost my hearing. I can't hear in my right, by the way, because I had to close the ears of my two little kids because they didn't know how to. They were crying and screaming with other kids in that tiny corridor. We were about more than 20 people in that corridor. So, my wife, myself, and my two little kids, I had to close their ears, and we had to use wet towels because there was very, very strange chemical smoke getting into the house where we were staying. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, the following day, 6 o'clock, when we left that house, the whole neighborhood was flattened down. Rimal doesn't exist anymore. I live close to my own university, Al-Aqsa University. It has been completely destroyed. And we had to move to the north where we were stayed with my brother in the north. The same scenario took place again after 3 days.
My gosh.
When they attacked the north, and we had to move to the south where we stayed with my sister in Rafah. And now, as I speak to you, they're attacking Rafah. Every 10 minutes, they kill a Palestinian child. By the time we finish this show, comrade, more than 5 kids will be killed.
That is terrible. And I think, one of the things that Israel has done very well is to try and focus the world's attention on October 7th. But we all know that this crisis did not begin on October 7th. And frankly, it's disingenuous to start there. Could you just sort of summarize for our viewers, where did this begin?
Yeah, we will need definitely more than one show in order to talk about that, but I will try to summarize as much as possible because people keep asking about October 7th and people keep asking about Hamas. And people tend to forget because there are facts and we need to deal with facts.
Exactly.
Hamas was established in 1987 only with the, at the beginning of the first Palestinian Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising in 1987. Between 1948 and 1987, there was no Hamas. This is number one. Number two, when Israel attacks, Gaza, people and mainstream media, unfortunately, propaganda, it's not a neutral media, it's a propaganda. People tend to portray the whole thing as if it is a conflict between apartheid Israel and Hamas.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Israel is a colonial power. Israel is in fact worse than the apartheid system that you people of South Africa experienced between 1948 and 1994. So what happened is that we were asked in January 2006, after the destruction of Iraq, when, if you remember, George Bush decided to spread democracy in the Middle East, he asked the people of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to head to the polling stations and vote for their representatives, hoping that the people of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank would vote for a pro-Oslo, a pro-two-state solution power. People went to the polling station in January 2006 and they voted against the two-state solution. They voted against the facade of the peace process, the facade of the two-state solution. And this is why apartheid Israel, together with the United States of America and in cahoot with reactionary Arab regimes, decided to impose a deadly, hermetic, medieval siege on the people of Gaza. That was January 2006. Between that time and 2020 and 23, we have been going through a medieval siege. In 2008, 2009, apartheid Israel decided to launch a massive attack against Gaza. Within 18 days, killing more than 1,200 people, including 450 children. As if that was not enough, they decided to repeat the same scenario in 2012, killing more than 200 people within 5 days. As if that was not enough, they decided to do the same thing in 2014, if you remember, comrade, for 51 days, killing 2,400 people. Then comes the Great March of Return in 2017. I was there. I witnessed all these massacres. I witnessed, I joined the Great March of Return, and I witnessed the 2021 massacre that took place in Gaza as well. And I remember very well the fear in my kids' eyes. And I knew that I couldn't protect them at the time. Apartheid Israel deliberately targets Palestinian children. I need to remind you, comrade, that 70% of the casualties of this ongoing genocide are children and women, by the way. 95% of those who got killed are civilians who are not involved in the attack against the Israeli soldiers. So this is the situation right now. Life in Palestine did not begin on October 7th. What happened on October 7th is that you have those youngsters, those young people who grew up actually under this medieval siege. They have no clue about life, outside the walls of the Gaza prison. People call Gaza, Amnesty International calls it an open-air prison.
Exactly.
And now, I beg to differ, by the way. I call it a concentration camp. Gaza has become an extermination camp. And what happened is that those prisoners inside the Gaza prison decided to bring down the walls of the Gaza ghetto, exactly like what happened to the Warsaw prisoners in the 40s of last century. I mean, prisoners, Jewish prisoners. We completely understand the horror that they went through in Warsaw
during the Holocaust.
That's absolutely good. And this is why what we are calling it, what is happening right now in Gaza, is a Holocaust, another Holocaust.
It is absolutely a Holocaust. And I think, I personally am offended when people, I sometimes get these right-wingers on my timeline, whether it's on Twitter or wherever, one of these platforms, who will say I'm an anti-Semite because I believe that what Israel is doing is another Holocaust. And it is a systematic extermination of an entire population of people. They are targeting children. It's a game. I mean, I've seen horrific videos, and I don't have to tell you, you were there, where, they will deliberately shoot at children. Where they've shot people who are waving white flags. All of these things are violations of international law, where they jail young children, and those of us who are progressive see that as kidnapping. They're kidnapping these children because what is the crime? What crime have these children committed? Maybe they threw a stone at a tanker. Like that deserves a jail sentence. And when they get arrested, they are tortured. One of the things I also wanted to talk about, because you are a professor at Al-Aqsa University. As we speak right now, all of the universities in Palestine have been destroyed.
In Gaza.
In Gaza.
That's correct.
All the universities in Gaza have been destroyed. 5
universities. The Islamic University of Gaza was the first university to be destroyed. Al-Azhar University, and then Al-Isra University, Al-Quds Open University, and lately they've decided to destroy the beautiful campuses of my own university in Khan Yunis and in Gaza, and they have been targeting academics. They have been targeting journalists, medical doctors, academics, intellectuals, trade union leaders. Yesterday, they targeted the dean of the nursing faculty of the Islamic University. They killed him. They killed his children, his wife. Altogether were 8 members of the family. More than 95 academics have been killed, including 2 of my own colleagues in my own department, and 20 other colleagues from other departments in my university.
Sure. Yeah. For those of us who are watching this, it's like and I'm not trying to minimize the situation when I say this, but the level of helplessness that we feel, it's like watching a horrible movie.
Yeah.
Because what we see on social media is just the abject suffering of ordinary people in Palestine. You know, the logic, if we analyze so-called logic of the brutal apartheid Israel state, they're saying that they're doing this to defend themselves. So in essence, they are going to blow up every single human being.
That's correct.
In their search for Hamas. This is what we're seeing.
Yeah, you know, two points here. As I said to you, it's not Israel versus Hamas. It's Israel as a colonial power, settler colony, versus the colonized Palestinians. But also people need to understand, it's not only Hamas that resists occupation and colonialism in Palestine. We have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Its military wing, Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades. It's a Leninist Marxist organization that was established in the late after 1967, after the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. You also have the military wing of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, another Maoist Marxist organization. You even have fighters belonging to Fatah, the right-wing organization that that controls the PLO, and to which the Palestinian president himself, Mahmoud Abbas, belongs. All these organizations are involved in the resistance in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. So it's not only limited to Hamas. This is number one. Number two, I mean, some people also say, as you said yourself just now, some people say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Did apartheid have the right to defend itself against the ANC, against ordinary people in Soweto and other townships in South Africa? When did apartheid have the right to defend itself? When did colonial powers have the right to defend themselves? I mean, in Algeria, France had the right to defend itself and kill more than 1.5 million people, civilians in Algeria. In order to defend France, did the Americans have the right to defend themselves in Vietnam, etc., etc.? And I think this is a myth that has to be deconstructed, and people need to understand that Israel is not only an apartheid state, it's a settler colony that practices a multi-tiered system of oppression against the Palestinian people. One form of that oppression is apartheid.
Yes.
Another form is direct military occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. A third form is ethnic cleansing. What is happening, comrade, right now in Gaza is a combination of genocide and ethnic cleansing.
It is our perspective as NUMSA that resistance is not terrorism, that what our perspective of resistance fighters fighting against unlawful occupation, as is the case in Palestine, is wholly justifiable. And we can say this because if we look at our own history and the battles that the South African working class took up against the apartheid system, there were protests, there were strikes, but there was also armed resistance through Umkhonto weSizwe.
That's correct.
So how do you fail to see the similarities between what the resistance that is flourishing, that is coming up in Palestine against this brutal occupation, and what MK did?
Yes. That's a very important question, comrade. I think, I have always been arguing that we needed to learn lessons from other struggles against colonialism and settler colonialism. And one of the closest cause to our heart, which is very similar to what we are going through right now in Palestine, is the anti-apartheid struggle here in South Africa. If you can recall, comrade, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you, in a way, talked about 4 pillars of struggle. And the first pillar of struggle was the armed struggle. When Nelson Mandela was arrested in 1964, and he was taken to the Rivonia trial, etc., etc. It was because of sabotage, because of the armed struggle.
Yes.
Now, people tend to forget that Nelson Mandela himself was considered a terrorist, not only by the apartheid regime, but by the colonial West. You remember Margaret Thatcher? Margaret Thatcher refused to meet at the beginning with Nelson Mandela, calling him a terrorist. Ronald Reagan himself, if you remember, they were talking about constructive engagement at the time, engaging the apartheid system, etc.
They were sanitizing it, actually.
That is correct. Until the late 80s. And Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were considering the ANC a terrorist organization in 1985, 1986. Mandela was released in 1990, and he became the first black president of multiracial, multicultural South Africa in 1994. Mandela was a terrorist because he resorted to armed struggle. But then you also talked about, mass mobilization, making townships ungovernable.
Absolutely.
You remember the late 80s. And you also talked about mass mobilization and international solidarity movement leading the anti-apartheid movement and BDS. And I am one of the co-founders of the BDS movement in Palestine. I am a member of the Gaza-based BNC Boycott National Committee. I'm one of the co-founders of PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. And all of that is based on lessons that we've learned from your struggle here in South Africa. And it is very important to understand that the oppressed, the colonized, have the right to resist the colonizer and the oppressor.
Absolutely. And, I really wish we had more time for this show, because there's so much I want to unpack. But the one thing I want to also touch on, because you are absolutely right when you talk about the similarities between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. Some would argue that the apartheid in Israel is on steroids. It's on another level, especially when you incorporate and you look at the brutality and the militarization and the direct violence that's being meted out. But one thing I picked up from your book, in your book, for example, you speak about the fact that you grew up under apartheid in South Africa.
No, in Palestine.
In Palestine. But you also experienced apartheid in South Africa.
The end of apartheid, yes.
Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. It's very important what you are raising right now, because I'm being asked the same question here in South Africa and also in Palestine. I arrived in South Africa actually 2 years after the end of apartheid. I arrived in South Africa in February 1997, where I got my PhD degree from the University of Johannesburg. Still, people were talking about it. I mean, 2 years was not enough to feel the real changes at the time. But when I compare the two apartheids, I also compare the struggle against apartheid. And as I said to you in my previous answer, that we've learned lessons from the struggle, your own struggle here against the apartheid system. One thing that people don't realize is that the establishment of Israel was in 1948. Also, apartheid became it's a form of institutionalized racism. And apartheid was adopted here in South Africa also in 1948. So you have apartheid in South Africa starting in 1948, and you also have Israel as an apartheid Israel established in 1948. But you people here in the late 50s, I think a handful of anti-apartheid activists, ANC, SACP activists, came together in London, and they decided to call on the international community to boycott the apartheid system, divest from it, and from international companies, and this is the point, international companies benefiting from the oppression of black people in South Africa, leading ultimately to the imposition of sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And we saw the result of that in the late 80s, leading to the release of Nelson Mandela and leading to the first democratic elections in 1994, to your freedom here in South Africa, in spite of the problems, the socioeconomic problems. But I'm talking about the legal system of apartheid, etc., etc. And this is why I started, upon returning to Gaza in 2005, using, the apartheid comparison. People didn't understand at the time. Apartheid Israel and the colonial West actually started accusing us of anti-Semitism, saying that apartheid Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East.
What a joke.
Exactly, what a joke. People don't understand that one, Israel does not have a constitution like any other democracy in the whole world. So how can you call it a liberal democracy? Israel defines itself as the state of Jews only.
Yeah.
So if you were born to a Jewish mother in New York, in Alaska, in Sri Lanka, you are entitled to an Israeli citizenship upon your arrival, in Tel Aviv. Whereas I was born in Palestine. My parents were born in Palestine, and I can take you back to centuries back, and still I don't have the right to Israeli citizenship.
My gosh.
Yeah. So I think people need to understand every single apartheid law you have here in South Africa is enacted also in Palestine. But to add insult to injury, and I remember what the late Desmond Tutu said to us upon his visit to Gaza and Palestine. Our comrade Ronnie Cassis as well. I'm talking about the leading anti-apartheid fighters. When they visited Palestine, they said, oh my God, apartheid was like a picnic compared to what you are going through right now. Give me, an example of the apartheid system attacking Soweto, attacking a black township with F-16, F-15, using phosphorus. It never happened like that under the heydays of apartheid. So I think it is important for people to understand that Israel, yes, is an apartheid state, and now I've started using even another term. Israel is a genocidal state. You are talking about a megalomaniac government that ruling that country, comrade. The last point I wanted to say is that you in South Africa, the apartheid system resorted to, giving you the right to have your own independent homeland.
The Bantustan.
Absolutely. Bantustans. In 1993, our right-wing leadership decided to strike a deal with apartheid Israel, accepting the establishment of Bantustans in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, leading to what they called the two-state solution. Yeah, the two-state solution is similar to the Bantustan system that you had here in South Africa.
We're going to talk about that because you talk about that a lot in your book. And in
That's
fact,
correct.
I want to touch on that. But before I touch on that, one of the things that you spoke about is that comparison of apartheid in South Africa and apartheid in Israel. I think the difference between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid is that the racist apartheid state of South Africa needed the black population.
Absolutely.
They were relying on them for cheap labor. I mean, how else were they going to get the diamonds out of the mines and the gold
And the surplus.
so they needed the labor to exist in order that they could exploit them. Yes, they did exterminate populations of black people in famous events, as you know, infamous events like the Sharpeville massacre, and of course the shootings that used to happen regularly during popular funerals, etc. But their goal was not to exterminate black people because they wanted to oppress them, right? They needed them.
Yes.
But apartheid Israel actually wants to wipe out Palestinians. That is their goal.
Yeah.
And just take over the land. And what are your thoughts, for example, on and I know I'm deviating a little bit, but it's just, I mean, I feel like Benjamin Netanyahu keeps telling people what he's going to do, and it's like they just ignore him. He has been saying, him and his, dastardly officials, that this is going to be worse than the Nakba, that they're going to, completely make Gaza ungovernable.
That's correct.
It is my personal view that his goal, his vision, is not just the extermination of Palestinians. It's not just the theft of land, but that he's actually going to expand. If you look at the plans for Rafah, for example.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, just touching on the point you raised, it's the difference between South Africa. One of the differences between South Africa and Palestine is that you have, in South Africa, exploitation, whereas in Palestine you have annihilation and extermination. And you are absolutely right. This is what happened in 1948, and this what has been going on since, we call it the Nakba. the catastrophe. What happened in 1948 is a process, or rather was a process of ethnic cleansing. What you are doing right now in Gaza, because people also keep asking me, why is Israel targeting Gaza in particular? No, Israel has been targeting the West Bank, has been targeting Palestinians who are considered third-class Israeli citizens, but Gaza in particular, because 2/3 of the Palestinians of Gaza are refugees entitled to their right of return in accordance with the United Nations Resolution 194. I myself, my wife, we are refugees. We are refugees. Our parents are refugees from an ethnically cleansed village in 1948, and they were forced to move to the Gaza Strip. And I was born in the Nusayrat refugee camp. I grew up as a refugee. My parents also died as refugees, dreaming of the day when they will be allowed to return to their village. So yes, that is one of the major differences. Now, the other point leading us, because I know we are running out of time, because I really wanted to touch on this, is that, what is the solution? In South Africa, what was the solution? The solution in South Africa was the collapse and the end of apartheid. You couldn't argue against that.
So the solution in this regard would be what? The collapse?
In Palestine, exactly. The collapse of apartheid and settler colonialism in Palestine, Israel, and the establishment of a secular democratic state a la South Africa. So now the problem is that our leadership and most nationalist organizations have accepted a racist solution, calling it an interim solution. You in South Africa went through this actually, two stages, if you remember very well. And I think you realized at the end that you can't compromise on your basic rights. So what I'm saying is that we need the implementation of international law when it comes to the Palestinian cause. One, we want the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in accordance with international law. Two, we want the implementation of our right of return to our villages and towns. Three, we want the collapse of the apartheid system in Palestine. That is the most practical solution that we can come up with.
You have actually described the two-state solution as the opium of the Palestinian people, because you're saying it's like it's a trick, And I mean, if you've been listening to some of the utterances, even from Benjamin Netanyahu himself, they're not interested in a two-state solution. But Joe Biden keeps talking about a two-state solution. How is that going to work?
Because they understand that they need to, in a way, as you talked about, sanitizing, the whole thing. They wanted, the Palestinian people to believe that, that there is a possibility of having a sovereign, independent Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Unfortunately, they managed to convince the official leadership of the Palestinian people in the late 80s, early 90s, and they convinced that leadership to sign the Oslo Accords with apartheid Israel.
Which you say were born dead. You say
that
in
is
your
correct.
book, the Oslo Accords were born dead.
For one reason, because these accords do not guarantee our basic rights, our basic and fundamental rights. If you have a look, if you read the Oslo Accords, unfortunately, most politicians that I have met have not read the accord, the Oslo Accords. Nothing whatsoever is mentioned about establishing an independent Palestinian state. That's number one. Number two, nothing whatsoever is mentioned about our right to self-determination. So how can you sign a deal that doesn't guarantee your right to self-determination, which is guaranteed under international law? Our right to self-determination means our basic rights, means the end of occupation, means the end of apartheid. Can you imagine South Africans accepting to sign a deal that does not lead to the end of apartheid, and then you say that's a good deal for the oppressed of South Africa? The last point, comrade, is that the two-state solution is a racist solution. It's a racist solution because it is based on the idea of establishing two states based on ethno-religious dimension. So a state for Muslims and Christians that we can call the state of Palestine on only 22% of Palestine, by the way.
Sure.
You know, people don't understand that. Whereas 78% will be given to Israeli Jews. And who are these Jews? These are Jewish immigrants who came from Eastern Europe, America, etc. Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews from the Middle East as well. Now, how can the international community accept something like this?
Sure. Final thoughts.
Yes.
There have been a lot of developments since October 7th. We've seen South Africa go to the ICJ. We've seen even this week, for example, recently we've seen more hearings at the ICJ where you had over 50 countries presenting cases on the illegality of the occupation by Israel in Palestine. When you look at some of the things like that and perhaps other things, do you have hope?
Yeah. Coming from Gaza, it's extremely difficult to tell you that we have hope.
Yeah.
Because as we are speaking right now, I know that at least 10 children are being killed. Yeah. The average, comrade, has been since the beginning of the genocide, 135 civilians per day.
Oh,
the figure I don't like to talk about numbers and figures, etc., but we have to do that. More than 30,000 people have been killed. All of whom are civilians. And you have 10,000 people who are still missing. And when we say that they are missing, we know that they are under the rubble. They've
not been found.
They have not been found.
Accounted for, yeah.
70,000 people have been, injured, etc., etc. 70% of housing units, including our housing units, have been destroyed. All universities, all hospitals in Gaza, about 1,300 schools have also been destroyed in the Gaza Strip. So it's extremely difficult to talk about hope. But at the same time, when you see countries like the government of South Africa that is saying to the international community, enough is enough, that we will fight apartheid hand in hand with the Palestinian people, you have hope.
Yeah.
You can see light at the end of the tunnel. When you hear, people like the president of Brazil, comparing what is happening to the Palestinians of Gaza to the Holocaust and what happened to innocent Jewish civilians in Europe during the Second World War, then you end up, believing that there is still humanity. We've ended up believing that you can have no faith in the official international community, governments of the colonial West, even the United Nations, even the Security Council, but you can have hope in civil society, in people's power, exactly like the hope you had, you people of South Africa in the 70s and 80s, when you believed that the international community, civil society, churches, mosques, sporting clubs, ordinary people would come in support of your struggle. And that is what happened. And this is what is going to happen to Palestine until we see the apartheid system of Israel crumbling and collapsing.
So one of the issues that is coming up very recently is the issue of Rafah and Israel's plans to actually, initiate a ground invasion of Rafah. Can you talk to us about what the implications of such action would be, especially considering the size of Rafah? There's hundreds of thousands of refugees,
Right, absolutely. Rafah is on the border with Egypt. And as I said, Israel's aim is to push the people of Gaza outside of Gaza as part of its process of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians of Gaza, because the overwhelming majority of Gazans are refugees. You have 8 refugee camps in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. I myself, I was born in the Nusayrat refugee camp, but I grew up in Gaza City, and I lived in Gaza City. Now, at the beginning of the genocide, the Israelis asked the people of the northern part of Gaza, including Gaza City, to move to the south. south. Most of the people moved to the city of Deir al-Balah in the middle areas and to Rafah itself. Rafah is a tiny strip of land. The population of Rafah is 250,000. Right now, the overwhelming majority of the population of the Gaza Strip has moved to Rafah. I'm talking about 1.4 million living in Rafah now, in tents, on the streets, etc., etc. And this is what Israel has been aiming at, asking people to move from the north to the middle and to the south. And now the majority of people have moved from the middle areas to Rafah. So now the Israelis want to push the people of Gaza outside of Rafah into the Sinai Desert.
Yeah.
So now Egypt is expected to receive more than 1.5 million refugees from the Gaza city. Now, of course, people cannot find enough food, do not have clean water, do not have drinking water, do not have medicine, etc., in Rafah itself. I spent the first 2 months of the genocide in Rafah itself. And I can tell you, and I'm talking about the first 2 months of the genocide, it was unbearable. There were nights when my 2 little kids would ask for food and I couldn't provide them with food. Gosh. They would ask for a sip of water and I couldn't provide them with a sip of water. Now it is even much worse.
Sure.
It is much, much worse. Yeah.
Can I just ask, how did it make you feel as a parent, being in a situation like that, where you cannot even provide your children with something as basic as water or food?
Yeah, I always keep reminding people of the story of Jana Qudeh from Khan Younis. Every single time people ask me, Jana Qudeh is from Khan Younis. She was 10 years old and she was with her father. They couldn't find food. It's not that you cannot afford to buy. It's that the food is not there.
Food.
Exactly. She asked for water. The father couldn't provide her with food and water for 3 days until she died.
Oh my gosh.
Until she died. Many people are being starved to death deliberately as a deliberate policy by Apartheid Israel. How did I feel? I felt terrible. I felt terrible. When my kids asked me for food and I couldn't provide them, with food. I couldn't, because I couldn't find. And, you just want to find anything. Now, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who lives in the Jabalia refugee camp in the north now, who is starving. He has 4 kids and his wife. And he said, we cannot find even animals' food to find my kids. Yesterday, I got that phone call. I managed to get hold of it. Animals' food, we can't find animal.
No animal feed.
No, nothing. Weeds. They're collecting weeds in order to feed their children. So it's horrific. It's horrific. And the world is watching and doing absolutely nothing.
And drinking seawater because there's no
drinking
water.
Seawater.
Women have no sanitary towels, tampons.
At all. Yeah.
They're using pieces of tents. I mean, it is shocking. The word shocking doesn't even come close to describing the suffering that's being inflicted. And I think this is why the biggest question for progressives is, how do we help? What can we do? What are the concrete steps that we can take to assist?
Yeah. Well, conscious people need to understand that, the Palestinian question did not, as we said, did not begin on the 7th of October. Started in 1948. Now, Palestinian civil society, after, studying lessons from South Africa and learning from your own struggle, Palestinian civil society decided to issue a call in 2005. And here, when I say Palestinian civil society, I'm talking about the overwhelming majority of Palestinian civil society sectors, calling on the international community to boycott Apartheid Israel, divest from it, and impose sanctions against it until it complies with international law. So that call came out in 2005. At the beginning of the ongoing genocide, we also issued another call. Yes, we want the international community to boycott Apartheid Israel. We expect all workers to boycott Apartheid Israel, especially the working class, especially South African working class. But also we have, immediate tasks. We want an immediate ceasefire.
Yeah.
Immediate ceasefire. As we are speaking, people
are
are
dying.
getting killed. People are dying. So we want an immediate ceasefire. I remember, just touching on the ICJ case again and the ICJ ruling, we are very happy that South Africa has decided to hold apartheid Israel accountable to war crimes and crimes against humanity. When I talk to my relatives and my friends and my comrades in Gaza, they said, does that mean there will be a ceasefire now?
Yeah.
We need to understand
they need
the mechanism.
immediate action.
Exactly.
They want something that's going to produce
Absolutely.
an end to their immediate suffering right now.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, yesterday, the United States of America, the head of imperialism, decided to veto an Algerian resolution, at the Security Council, calling for humanitarian ceasefire. The Americans don't think that we should have a ceasefire because the Americans are enablers of the genocide. So for the time being, what we want an immediate ceasefire, and we wanted free flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza because people are starving.
Yeah, I was horrified to see Israelis blocking the trucks.
Yeah.
I run out of words sometimes when I see the behavior of Israeli citizens.
Yeah.
I am shocked
Yeah.
at how they have conducted themselves in the face of such a blatant brutality. And it tells me that there's real power in the propaganda of apartheid Israel's machinery. There they are, blocking food to people who are starving,
Yeah. I have very bad news, actually, is that Israel is a fascist state.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yesterday, a survey was conducted by the National Security Institute of Israel, top institute. 63% of Israelis support the war on Gaza. Last week, another survey was conducted. It was 69 Israelis support the blocking of humanitarian aid into Gaza. In other words, you are not only talking about an apartheid state, you are talking about a state, a government, a community, settler colonial community that is showing, a fascistic tendency.
And a mindset, like a collective mindset, a collective genocidal mindset.
That's correct.
Which is why radical action must be taken. And economic sanctions would go very well in dealing with that. Because if we're honest, under apartheid, we had a very racist white population who were very comfortable with the situation.
Of course.
And were not interested in changing the conditions because they were benefiting. And it was only when they were uncomfortable, and their discomfort was caused by economic and cultural sanctions. Whenever they traveled overseas, they were treated like pariahs. Most of them didn't even tell people that they were from South Africa because they were scared they'd be insulted and shunned. When their business interests started being affected because of the economic sanctions, then they started to reach out to the liberation movement and have negotiations. Clearly, there is a direct link to economic sanctions as a stick to sort of, persuade the local population into doing the right thing.
Absolutely. And that's the lesson that we've learned from South Africa. I myself was also an anti-apartheid activist. I remember in the 80s, when I had, Nelson Mandela's, picture and so, calling for an end to apartheid and boycotting all, South African products at the time. We've learned our lessons from you people here in South Africa. And this is precisely what we are doing right now. And this is why civil society in Palestine and nationalist and Islamist organizations have decided to endorse our call for BDS, boycott of apartheid Israel.
So, this, I know this must be very difficult for you, especially because you have small children. How were you actually able to get out? These conditions that are just unbelievable that people are going through. What did you do to actually escape and find yourselves here?
Yeah, I'm one of those privileged people who happen to have, a foreign passport. When I came to South Africa in the late 90s, I managed to get, permanent residency and then get a South African passport. Luckily, the South African embassy in Ramallah in Palestine kept calling us. At the beginning of the massacre, the Israelis did not allow anybody to leave Gaza for the first couple of weeks. And then they started allowing foreign nationals. And they started with the Americans, the Germans, the Brits. South African citizens, including myself, were left till the end because apartheid Israel wanted to punish the South African government for the stance it took against the genocide taking place in Gaza. After 2 months of the genocide, our names, we have about 19 South African nationals in Gaza, or rather we had at the time 19 South African nationals in Gaza. We were contacted after 2 months, and we were told that our names were on the list. And we were the last national passport holders to be allowed to leave Gaza at the time. So luckily, I was privileged enough to have that South African passport. And I must say again, thank you to the South African government. Thank you to the South African embassies in Ramallah and in Cairo. Because the South African embassy in Cairo sent a team of 3 diplomats to receive us at the Rafah crossing. And they waited with us. And it was a journey. Usually, from Rafah to Cairo, it takes, 5 to 6 hours. It took us 28 hours.
My gosh.
And the South African team was with us all along. So that's what happened.
Sure. Wow. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, we could talk forever on this topic. And I just want to thank you so much, Professor, for giving us your time, for sharing your thoughts. Our hearts are with you and your family as you go through this horrendous struggle. And we believe with you that change will come. It's inevitable. It is inevitable. All dictators, autocrats must fall, and apartheid Israel will fall. And I want to really just encourage our viewers, having watched this, if there is a rally in your community, in your school, in your area, Palestinian rally, I'd like to encourage you to join. The struggles that they are going through are the struggles that we went through during the dark days of apartheid. And we did not come out of it without international support. And so they need our international support. So I want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Workers' Power, where we aim to give a voice to the voiceless and empower the powerful working class to change the world. Thank you. Remember to follow NUMSA Media on YouTube. Like, subscribe, and share to as many people as you know.